The storm was unlike anything Alex had ever seen. The dark clouds above RE154 churned and twisted, as if the planet itself was alive and angry. The wind howled, rattling the thin walls of their shelter, and the air smelled like something burning. Outside, the ground trembled with the roar of creatures that only existed in nightmares. Alex's heart pounded as they stood by the small window, staring out into the storm. The red sky was glowing like fire, casting an eerie light on the alien landscape. Jagged rocks and twisted trees littered the land, and in the distance, strange shapes moved. The Deathworld wasn't just a name, it was a warning. The humans were trapped in this nightmare. Alex turned away from the window and glanced over at the others. Captain Harlow, the leader of their small group, was giving orders to the soldiers, trying to keep everyone calm. But even Harlow seemed worried. The group had only been on RE154 for a few weeks, but already the planet's dangers were clear. The creatures out there weren't just wild animals. They were predators, hunting with intelligence, and they were getting closer. "Keep quiet and stay sharp," Harlow ordered, his voice steady but with a hint of tension. "If those things break through, we hold them off. We fight until the end." Alex swallowed, trying to ignore the fear creeping into their chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to be colonizing a new world, building something that humanity could call home. Instead, they were fighting to stay alive on a planet that seemed bent on destroying them. "Are we going to be okay?" Maya, one of the younger soldiers, whispered from the corner of the room. Her voice trembled, barely audible over the storm outside. Alex didn't know how to answer. The truth was, no one knew. They had been sent to RE154 to establish a new colony, but what they found wasn't a new world to tame. It was a planet that fought back at every turn. The creatures here were enormous, fast, and far more dangerous than anything Earth had to offer. Suddenly, the ground shook again, harder this time. The shelter's walls groaned, and dust fell from the ceiling. Alex's hand gripped the edge of the table as they steadied themselves. "We've got company," Captain Harlow said, his face grim. "Take your positions. Don't let them through." Alex grabbed their weapon and rushed to the front of the shelter. The others followed, moving quickly but quietly. There was no room for panic. They had learned it the hard way during their first few days on RE154. Panic got people killed. Outside, the storm raged on, but Alex could hear something else now. A low guttural growl. It was almost like the creatures were speaking to each other. The creatures were learning. They didn't just attack randomly anymore. They were using tactics, and that made them even more dangerous. Alex's mind raced. "We've seen them before," they thought, remembering the first sighting of these creatures days earlier. Huge, reptilian beasts with claws long enough to tear through steel. But there was something else in their eyes. Intelligence. Strategy. The thought made Alex shiver. "Get down," someone shouted. Alex dropped to the floor instinctively, but they could still hear the sound of something hitting the shelter's outer walls. The creatures were testing their defenses. The shelter was built strong, but even the toughest walls couldn't stop the force of the creatures' attacks. Alex knew this. It was only a matter of time before the shelter would break. Through the small window, Alex saw one of the creatures move closer. It was larger than any they had seen so far, its scales glowing in the dim red light. But what stood out was its eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes. It seemed to be watching them, studying them, almost as if it knew they were inside, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Wait," Alex thought, a strange realization hitting them. "That creature is different." Alex didn't know why, but something about the way the creature moved made them pause. It wasn't just attacking blindly like the others. It was waiting, calculating. It was learning. A loud crash broke Alex's thoughts. The shelter's main door buckled, then exploded inward with a deafening roar. The creatures were breaking through. Alex's heart raced. This is it. The fight for survival begins now. Get to the back. Captain Harlow shouted, pushing everyone toward the emergency exit. Move. Alex hesitated for only a second, then followed the others. There was no time to think, only to act. As they rushed toward the exit, the sound of claws scraping against metal filled the air. The creatures were getting inside. But there was something else, too. The sounds were different now. The growls weren't just coming from outside the shelter. There was something else, something more, deliberate. The group reached the back door, only to find it jammed. Panic began to rise again, but Alex pushed it down. They couldn't afford fear now. Not when everything was on the line. Help me. Jenna, one of the other soldiers, cried out. She was struggling with the door, trying to force it open, but it was stuck. Alex rushed to help, and together they managed to force the door open just enough to squeeze through. They emerged into the stormy night, their hearts pounding with the fear of what lay ahead. The creatures were close, too close. As they sprinted across the rocky landscape, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The creatures were learning, and they were not alone. Something more intelligent than they had ever imagined was waiting for them on this Deathworld. The storm had passed, but the danger was far from over. The eerie silence that followed felt worse than the chaos of the storm itself. The group huddled in the dark, their weapons ready, eyes darting to every shadow and every movement. Alex's mind raced, still replaying the events of the last few hours. The creatures, those massive, terrifying beasts, had not only attacked the shelter but had almost broken through. They were smart, too smart. Something about their behavior didn't sit right. It wasn't just the physical threat they posed. It was their intelligence, the way they adapted so quickly to every move the humans made. Alex could barely focus as Captain Harlow gathered the team around the map. They had to make a decision quickly. The shelter was no longer safe. The creatures knew where they were, and it wouldn't be long before they found another way in. The only option was to move to the abandoned military base several miles away. The hope was that the base might still have functioning communications equipment, and maybe, just maybe, they could send a distress signal to Earth. But the journey would be perilous, and they all knew it. There was no telling how many more creatures were out there, or how many humans they might encounter along the way. With the storm now behind them, the air was thick with tension. The group moved quietly, staying low to the ground and moving in a tight formation. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot sent a jolt of fear through them. The terrain was rough, sharp rocks, twisted trees, and patches of thick, wet mud that slowed them down. But it wasn't the terrain that had Alex on edge. It was the feeling that something was following them. The creatures had already shown they could track them, but this felt different. Alex couldn't shake the idea that they weren't just being hunted. They were being stalked. Hours passed in tense silence. The only sounds were the crunch of footsteps, the occasional whisper, and the wind in the trees. The group stopped occasionally to rest, but even in their brief moments of calm, they couldn't let their guard down. Every so often, Alex would glance over their shoulder, certain they were being watched. Then, without warning, a sound broke the silence, a distant growl, low and rumbling, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. The creatures were closing in. Captain Harlow signaled for them to move faster, but it was clear that they were being herded. The growls grew louder, closer. Alex's heart pounded as they sprinted through the thickening forest. The sound of claws scraping against rock echoed behind them, unmistakable. It wasn't just one creature, it was several, and they were faster than expected. As the group moved, trying to outrun the creatures, Alex's mind raced. The creatures had been relentless, but there was something more troubling than just the threat of being eaten. The way they attacked wasn't random. They had a pattern, a purpose. They were learning, adapting. Could they be more than just predators? Alex had seen their intelligence in action, but there was no time to figure it out now. The team had to survive. Suddenly, a scream cut through the air. It was Jenna, one of the soldiers at the rear of the group. Alex spun around, only to see Jenna struggling against a massive, clawed arm that had shot out from the shadows. The creature was huge, its glowing red eyes locked onto its prey. Before anyone could react, the creature ripped Jenna from the group and dragged her into the darkness, her screams fading into the distance. Alex felt a cold wave of dread wash over them. There was no time for hesitation. The team had lost one of their own, and they couldn't afford to lose anyone else. Captain Harlow yelled for them to keep moving, but Alex couldn't shake the image of Jenna being dragged away. They had to make it to the base. If they didn't, they wouldn't just lose the fight for survival. They would lose everything. The thought pushed them forward, even as exhaustion weighed heavily on their shoulders. They could hear the creatures now, closing in, but they kept moving, knowing that every step brought them closer to safety, or closer to their doom. The path ahead was unclear, but there was no turning back. The base, their only hope, was still a few miles away. But the creatures were getting closer, and soon they would have no choice but to fight. They had no choice but to survive. The journey to the abandoned military base had become even more treacherous than Alex had anticipated. Every step was a risk. The terrain seemed to shift beneath them as the group navigated through thick forests and jagged hills. The air was heavy, humid, and thick with the scent of decay, a constant reminder that they were in a world that didn't want them here. The creatures were still following them, their growls echoing through the forest, louder now, as if they were being driven by something more than hunger. Alex kept their eyes peeled, scanning the surroundings with every movement. They could feel the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end, a primal sense of dread pulling at their nerves. It wasn't just the creatures that haunted their thoughts. Something didn't feel right. The creatures, with their intelligence and coordination, weren't acting like wild animals anymore. There was a method to their attacks, a pattern that Alex couldn't quite piece together. They weren't just hunting. They were working together, moving like a unit, almost like they were being led by someone or something else. "Stay focused," Captain Harlow barked, his voice cutting through Alex's thoughts. "We've got to make it to the base, no matter what." The group nodded, though Alex could see the doubt in their eyes. The loss of Jenna still hung over them, heavy like a shadow that refused to lift. Every time Alex looked at the others, they saw the fear in their faces, the silent question in their eyes. Will we make it out of here alive? They pushed on, but as the hours passed, fatigue set in. The creatures were closing in faster than expected, their roars growing closer. Each step felt like it brought them deeper into danger. Alex's legs ached, and their chest burned with every breath. But there was no time to stop. Then, as they rounded a sharp turn in the trail, something caught Alex's eye. A figure, a human figure. Alex's heart skipped a beat. Were they seeing things? It was too early to reach the military base. "Hold up," Alex whispered, raising a hand. Everyone stopped, immediately falling into a tense silence. Captain Harlow nodded and signaled for the group to crouch behind a rock formation. Alex squinted through the trees, trying to get a clearer view of the figure. It was moving slowly, too slowly for someone who was in a hurry. The figure stumbled, then fell to its knees. It was a man. No, a soldier, by the looks of it, wearing the same kind of gear they had. But there was something wrong. His clothes were torn, blood-stained, and his eyes were wide with panic. "Do you think he's from another group?" Maya whispered, her voice trembling with hope. "I don't know," Alex muttered, feeling the gnawing unease in their gut. Something about the man didn't feel right, but they couldn't leave him out there. If he was alive, they had to help him. Alex stepped forward slowly, raising their weapon just in case. They moved closer to the fallen soldier, their heart racing. As they approached, the man lifted his head, his eyes wide with fear. He tried to speak, but his voice was a hoarse whisper. "Don't go any further," he gasped. "They're watching, waiting. They'll kill you all." His words were slurred, and it was clear he was in shock. But what struck Alex the most was the look in his eyes, a look of pure terror. This wasn't just fear of the creatures. This was something else. Before Alex could ask any more questions, a terrifying roar ripped through the air, and the soldier's eyes widened in terror. "They're here. They're here," he whispered, his voice breaking. His body began to shake violently, and then, without warning, he screamed. Alex didn't have time to react. From the trees, the creatures emerged, their massive forms crashing through the underbrush. They were faster than before, more aggressive, and they weren't alone. The figure Alex had seen earlier was gone, disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the soldier's bloodied body behind. The creatures charged. Alex didn't hesitate. They turned and ran, signaling for the group to move as quickly as possible. The sounds of the creatures' footsteps thundered behind them, but Alex knew they couldn't outrun them forever. They had to find cover, or they would be hunted down one by one. They sprinted through the forest, dodging trees and leaping over rocks, their hearts pounding in their chests. Alex's breath came in short, sharp gasps. The creatures were closing in, and Alex could hear their growls growing louder, more frantic. It was as if they were hunting with a purpose now. No longer just mindless predators. They were chasing them, tracking them. Suddenly, the ground beneath Alex's feet gave way. A pit opened up in front of them, a steep drop into what appeared to be a ravine. Without thinking, Alex jumped. They barely made it to the other side, their fingers brushing the edge of the rocks as they scrambled to pull themselves up. They could hear the others behind them, their own desperate cries of fear echoing in the air. But as Alex pulled themselves up, they glanced behind them and saw something that made their blood run cold. The creatures weren't just chasing them. They were coordinated. They were using the terrain, moving as if they were planning every step. Alex's heart raced as they realized what this meant. This wasn't just a hunt. They were being hunted with a strategy. They were being led. Something was guiding them, controlling them. The realization hit Alex like a punch to the gut. The creatures weren't acting alone. There was something, or someone, else out there. Something that was pulling the strings, orchestrating the hunt. And the group was in far more danger than they had ever imagined. They had to get to the base. They had to warn the others. And they had to survive long enough to understand what was happening before it was too late. The military base was still miles away. But the further Alex and the team moved, the more the sense of danger seemed to grow. The creatures were relentless, and now, more than ever, it was clear that they weren't simply hunting. They were being guided. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led into a trap, a thought that made their stomach twist. The creatures weren't acting randomly. They were learning, adapting, and working together with a purpose. The group was in a race against time, and every step felt like it brought them closer to the edge of a cliff they couldn't see. Captain Harlow's face was grim as he led the way through the dense woods, his eyes scanning the horizon constantly. The group had already lost one of their own, Jenna, and they couldn't afford to lose anyone else. The loss of Jenna had affected them all, but it had hit Captain Harlow the hardest. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced with a tightness, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. Every decision now seemed to carry the weight of their survival on it. "Keep moving," Harlow ordered, his voice low but firm. "We're almost there." But Alex wasn't so sure anymore. Every step felt like it was taking them deeper into a nightmare, not closer to safety. The military base had once been a place of refuge, a symbol of strength and protection, but now it felt like a false hope, if they could even reach it. The creatures were getting smarter. They were no longer attacking blindly. They had learned to stay just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to strike. Alex glanced over their shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but the trees were still. The silence was deafening. But that silence was broken by a distant roar, a chilling sound that sent a wave of unease through Alex's body. It was close. Too close. "We've got to keep moving," Alex said, voice tight. "They're behind us." Without waiting for a response, they pushed forward, faster now, desperation taking hold. They had to get to the base. The creatures were closing in, and they had no idea how long they could keep up the pace. The deeper they moved into the forest, the more the terrain became an obstacle. Sharp rocks, thick roots, and dense vegetation that slowed them down. And all the while, the creatures were still out there, watching, waiting. Captain Harlow gave a sharp whistle, and the group stopped. They huddled together behind a large boulder, the sense of danger almost suffocating. "Everyone, stay quiet," Harlow whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're close." Alex crouched low to the ground, holding their breath. The growls grew louder, then the heavy thud of feet pounding the earth. It wasn't just one creature this time. It was a whole pack. The ground shook as they neared, and Alex's heart raced. They had to make it to the base, but there was no way they could outrun these creatures now. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught Alex's eye. A figure standing between them and the base, moving silently but with purpose. The figure didn't seem to notice them at first, and Alex's breath caught in their throat. Who was it? Another survivor? An enemy? They couldn't tell. Captain Harlow nodded at Alex, signaling to approach quietly. Alex moved forward cautiously, their mind racing. Every instinct told them to stay hidden, but they needed to know what the figure was doing. Were they being led into a trap, or was there another group of humans trying to survive? The figure turned, and Alex saw them more clearly. A woman, about their age, with a rifle slung over her shoulder. Her eyes were scanning the trees, her expression hard and focused. She didn't seem surprised to see Alex, but she didn't seem friendly either. "Who are you?" Alex asked, voice steady but filled with caution. "Are you with the creatures?" The woman's eyes flicked to them quickly, then she shook her head. "I'm not with them," she said, her voice low. "But they're here, and they're getting smarter. We've got to move now. They're already ahead of you." Alex's heart sank. They'd thought they were making progress, but now, hearing those words, they realized just how outmatched they were. They had been running, but it seemed like the creatures had been waiting for them all along. "How do you know?" Alex asked, stepping closer. The woman glanced back at the forest, her hand resting on the rifle. "I've been here long enough to know," she replied, her eyes dark with fear. "I thought I was safe when I got to the base, but they were already waiting for me. They know our tactics. They know how we move." Her eyes met Alex's, and for a moment, the weight of their situation hit Alex all at once. The creatures weren't just predators. They were learning. They were adapting to human behavior, mimicking them, anticipating their every move. Alex felt the blood drain from their face. The realization was terrifying. The creatures were smarter than anyone had thought, and the military base, which had once been their last hope, might now be their tomb. "We can't stay here," the woman said, her voice sharp with urgency. "You don't know what they're capable of. I barely got out of there alive. But we need to move. The base is compromised." The words hit Alex like a punch. Everything they'd been fighting for, everything they'd hoped for, it was all slipping away. But there was no time to dwell on that now. The creatures were closing in. The woman's warnings were clear. They had no chance of survival if they stayed put. Captain Harlow gave the signal to move. "Keep your heads down. We make for the base. Fast. No more delays." The group set off again, this time with no hope of safety, only a desperate need to survive. The woman, who had introduced herself as Sarah, led the way, her eyes scanning the trees constantly. The rest of the group followed, pushing forward with every ounce of energy they had left. But the deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to close in around them. It was as though the world was pressing in on them from every side. The creatures weren't far behind. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig, felt like a warning. They were closing in, and time was running out. And then, as they rounded the final corner toward the base, Alex saw something that made their blood run cold. In the distance, the military base loomed, but it was not the safe haven they had hoped for. The gates were open, the walls were torn, and from the inside, they could hear the growl of something far worse than any creature they had encountered. The base was no longer a refuge. It had become a battleground. The base was supposed to be their last hope, their sanctuary from the madness of RE154. But as Alex and the rest of the team stared at the wreckage of what had once been a well-fortified outpost, all hope seemed to fade into the smoke that rose from the shattered walls. The military base wasn't just compromised. It had been overrun, and not by just any creatures. The ones that had been hunting them were here too, moving with purpose and intelligence, as though they knew exactly what they were doing. Sarah led the group forward, her expression grim. "This is no longer a shelter," she muttered under her breath. "This is a death trap." Captain Harlow's voice was low but resolute. "We need to move in. We can't stop here. We don't have a choice." Alex glanced at the others, their faces pale with fear, but no one spoke. No one disagreed. They all knew what was at stake. Their lives depended on getting inside the base, finding anything that could help them communicate with Earth, or at least survive long enough to make it out. As they crept closer to the shattered gates, Alex's heart pounded in their chest. The base's walls, once sturdy and imposing, were now jagged and broken, the metal torn like paper. Dark shadows shifted within the ruins, and the unmistakable growls of the creatures echoed through the air, each sound growing louder as they approached. It wasn't just the sheer number of them that was terrifying. It was the knowledge that these creatures were no longer hunting for food alone. They were hunting for something more, something far more dangerous. "They're waiting," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, eyes scanning the darkened ruins. "They've set up a perimeter. They're waiting for us to make a mistake." Alex looked around, their senses heightened to every creak of the wind, every slight movement. The creatures were learning. They were adapting. It was as though they were evolving with each encounter, understanding their enemies better than Alex ever thought possible. The realization sent a cold chill through their body. They weren't just animals anymore. They were something else entirely. Captain Harlow motioned for everyone to stay low, signaling that they would enter through the side of the base, a narrow gap in the wall that hadn't been completely destroyed. They moved swiftly but quietly, hearts racing as they passed through the broken gates. The inside of the base was eerily quiet, too quiet. The air was thick with dust, and the distant sound of what might have once been machinery or communication systems was now nothing more than a haunting reminder of what they had lost. As they moved deeper into the base, Alex could feel the tension building. Every room they passed seemed to echo with the memories of soldiers who had once worked here, lived here. The base had been a symbol of human strength. Now it felt like a tomb. They reached the control room, but when Captain Harlow pushed open the door, Alex's stomach sank. The room was in ruins, but that wasn't what made their blood run cold. It was the figures inside. At first, Alex thought they were dead soldiers. But as their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they realized they were something far worse. They were humans, or at least, they had been once. The creatures had dragged the bodies into the control room, twisted them, torn them apart. But they hadn't killed them entirely. The bodies were moving, twisting, jerking in unnatural ways, like marionettes being controlled from somewhere deep inside. Alex froze, horrified. "What is this?" They whispered, their voice shaky. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with disgust. "They're not just predators," she said, her voice full of disbelief. "They're turning us into them. They're evolving us into their kind." Captain Harlow took a step back, eyes scanning the room quickly. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. A low growl echoed through the room, followed by a heavy thud. The creatures were inside, their massive bodies filling the doorway. Their eyes locked onto the survivors, the same calculating intelligence Alex had seen in them before. They were waiting, watching. There was no way out. The control room was surrounded. "Move," Captain Harlow shouted. "Get to the backup exit now." They didn't need another command. The group spun, running toward the only other way out, a narrow hallway that led to an underground tunnel system. But as they ran, Alex's mind raced. The creatures weren't just hunting. They were learning, adapting, and now they were evolving. The realization hit Alex like a hammer. The creatures had been experimenting. The bodies in the control room weren't just victims. They were test subjects. RE154 wasn't just a Deathworld. It was a laboratory, and the creatures were the scientists. They had been studying humanity, using their technology, their biology, to understand them in ways no one could have ever imagined. And now, the humans were part of the experiment. They were the prey, but they were also the catalyst for something far more dangerous. The hallways of the base seemed to stretch endlessly before them, their footsteps echoing as they ran. The growls behind them grew louder, more ferocious. The creatures were getting closer. Alex's lungs burned, and their legs felt like lead, but there was no stopping now. They had to make it to the tunnels. Finally, after what felt like hours, they'd reached the exit, an old, rusted hatch that led underground. Captain Harlow pulled it open with all his strength, and one by one, the group slipped through, barely managing to get inside before the creatures were upon them. Alex felt a moment of relief as they slammed the hatch shut, the thick metal sealing them in darkness. They were safe, for now. But even as they caught their breath, the feeling of being watched never left Alex. The creatures were still out there, just beyond the hatch, waiting. And something darker, far more insidious, was at play. They weren't just trapped in a war against alien creatures anymore. They were trapped in a war against a world that had its own plans for humanity. As the group descended into the dark, cold tunnels beneath the base, the true weight of their situation began to settle in. They had no way to contact Earth, no way to send a message for help. All they had now were the tunnels, each one leading them further into the unknown. And with every step, Alex knew that time was running out. The creatures were learning, and soon they would be unstoppable.